Hello and welcome to Paper Pilgrims, a new literary podcast. Travel with us through time as we explore books from around the world. I'm Sneha Nagesh.
And I'm Alex Breeden.
We've just finished the end of Notebook 3 Part 1. And we've seen that Yozo is living a very comfortable life with his new wife, Yoshiko, who's much younger than him. It's sort of his first stab at living a normal life. He's also drawing a bit and he's doing all these things that are positive for him.
In the next notebook, Part 2 of Notebook 3, we have him hanging out with Horuki, and they're sort of seem to have like a normal friendship going on now. They have this little game that they're playing between them where they're talking about tragic versus comic nouns, right? In this game, every noun is either comic or tragic, such as injections, right, are tragic in their schema, whereas death is comic. So if you were writing a comedy and you included the word injections, it would be out of place. And then we get to the next game, which is antonyms, but they're not like normal antonyms. So the antonym of black is white, which is what you would expect, right? But the antonym of white is red. So there's some sort of ulterior logic going on here. They're trying to avoid the cliche connections that people make, right? And trying to get to some other more interesting understanding of things. It's not at all clear why red is the opposite of white. But when you get to the later things, entrails is the opposite of milk, which is a really interesting connection in general.
It's true because it's like society is full of these things where first of all, maybe it's easier for human beings to think about things in pairs. I don't know.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
You always conjure up the image of black when you think of white, for sure. Right. And I've never questioned it.
Right, yeah, so that's a good point. They're questioning these sort of ingrained antonyms, ingrained pairs, trying to get to what are really the true connections and contrasts out there.
Or what they perceive or what they think are true connections. So it's just being more critical about very, very obvious things. So they continue playing this game. I enjoyed this interaction because it's a bit different to what we normally see Horuki and Yozo doing together, which is often getting wasted and destroying themselves. Clearly a match for each other even at an intellectual level, but maybe they struggle to sort of, concentrate on that aspect of the relationship because they always end up drinking.
Gets to the important part as they get past these sort of general antonyms, and then they get to the... Yozo brings up crime, right? Okay,
so they're playing this game, and then clearly this has a big impact on Yozo, because talking about crime, and I don't know why, but Yozo feels like a criminal.
Yeah, he's obsessed with the idea of crime and what is the antonym of crime, right?
This part sort of shows the reader how Yozo perceives crime, because... say, like, I would perceive a crime as going against what the society has defined as laws. But I think Yozo has his own, and that's kind of the point of this game, he has his own definitions or explanation of what crimes are. And he probably feels like, possibly if every time he made a joke or he didn't tell the truth, he was like, he was clowning, he probably felt like he was committing a crime.
Yeah, he just feels, it goes back to that, on one level, I think it goes back to that general sense of isolation, right, in the title of the book being No Longer Human, where he feels like a criminal and he's outside of the rest of humanity. But on the other hand, I think it connects with the scene we're going to see next, so we'll get to that shortly. But yeah, definitely it's a little vague.
So the book is written retrospectively, and I think it becomes clearer to the reader why this antonym game is so important later. But as you're reading this, it's kind of hard to figure out why Yozo's paying so much weight to it.
Right, it just feels like he's... Well, he is technically a criminal because he assisted in Tsuneko's suicide.
Maybe that was the sort of pushing, it pushed him into the edge. He was always at the edge of being a criminal and then actually committing this double suicide.
I think that's a suitable interpretation. But going to the next scene, we get the other possible interpretation, right? So at the end of this game, Horuki goes down to get some beans that Yozo's wife is preparing. And then Horuki kind of like tells him to come down and look, and they see Yozo's wife being raped.
Horuki asks, he doesn't shout, or so when he sees this happening in front of his eyes, he doesn't make any exclamations or disturb the scene in any way. He actually decides to go back to Yozo
Right.
So this could mean either that he wasn't sure about what was happening and maybe he thought that, or he wanted Yozo to establish the truth of the matter himself. He knew what was happening and he wanted Yozo to establish the truth of the matter, which shows a more disturbing side of Horiki.
I don't know. I didn't really get anything disturbing out of it. I just sort of felt like, I mean, if you see something really terrible, you don't necessarily try to jump in and solve it, right? Not everyone is that active in their personality, I guess. So I just took it like,
I guess that's it. Maybe it's a different character.
yeah,
But it certainly shows this aspect of Horiki's character.
he's not a hero. This goes back to the other possible interpretation of crime, which is that Yoshiko is just such a trusting person. And then the reason she gets raped is because she trusts this random guy and she doesn't expect him to try to do anything to her, right?
I think the guy who rapes her is a shopkeeper who is clearly like a familiar character.
Right.
Both Yozo and Yoshiko have encountered this person. They've had interactions with him. So it's not like some stranger just dropped in from the street.
I think this goes to the core of the book, which is that Yozo views trust as a crime in general that inevitably results in the punishment of the individual who is trusting. And it goes back to, the first notebook where we see Yozo refusing to trust anyone because of the what had happened with the servants, right?
It's sort of ingrained in his mind.
That he shouldn't trust anyone. So that's my interpretation of the crime and punishment.
This chapter has a very... it affects Yozo very badly.
As one would expect it to.
He doesn't really talk to Yoshiko about it. He just sort of goes, they just go about their life, and he has a very interesting sort of, approach towards this whole thing.
He really begins to spiral downwards now.
Yeah, because Yoshiko is not, Yoshiko up until now has been very trustworthy, and that's what Yozo really likes about her, because he can't do it himself. He cannot trust people. And to see someone trust people so blindly was, it just showed him, it maybe helped him think about the innocence, that there's still some innocence out there in this world, but then this happens.
That was his key to connecting with people.
Yoshiko starts questioning everything and being sort of on the edge whenever she's around Yozo. So this is not good for him, which means that he, once again, starts to drink.
Right, and because he's drinking, he needs money, and at this point, he begins to copy quote-unquote pornographic pictures, which in the original Japanese is shunga, which is if you've ever seen the ukiyo-e prints, which are really popular. The most famous one is the waves at Kanagawa, which are these giant blue pretty waves, right, by Hokusai. But Hokusai also did these other prints which are like really pornographic, and those are shunga, and this is what Yozo will be copying. So it's just like a weird cultural phenomenon in Japan where you have like the best artists of like the Edo period, 17th, 18th century, who are doing these amazing prints, but they're also doing pornography. It's like if Leonardo da Vinci did pornographic paintings.
And then use it to buy alcohol for himself and get wasted.
Exactly.
So Yozo drinks, so he keeps drinking, he's drawing all these pornographic prints. I don't know what he thinks about drawing pornographic. He sort of seems to enjoy it in a way.
Well, he said, which I secretly peddled, so I assume it's probably not broadcasting that, because he needs to stop drinking because it's killing him. But the only way to do that he can see is to get on morphine. He goes to the pharmacy, gets on morphine to try to stop drinking. Then he becomes addicted to morphine. And because of that, he gets put into an asylum. And then you have the sentence disqualified as a human being. So he's finally reached the point where he really feels like he's completely beyond being included in the human race.
Yeah, at this point, Yozo he's drunk a lot of alcohol. He's consumed lots of drugs. He's slept with many prostitutes. He's been complicit in a double suicide where the other person died. He has been interrogated by the police. He's seen his wife raped and not done anything about it. And he's in an asylum. So I can see why Yozo feels
he's not. Bad.
It's pretty
At the
bad.
Same time, most of it is not too far out of, like, a lot of people's experiences, who have lived harder lives, like being an addict or whatever.
Yes.
So it's not like he hasn't done anything like completely ridiculously outside of the general human experience.
But some of the things are a bit out of the general human experience. But yeah, I would say the parts that led him to the stage where he actually ended up in those places, such as in helping with a double suicide, or in not doing anything when he saw his wife raped, like all the drugs and the alcohol and the prostitution, etc., that led him there, those are within the
Sure.
within the norm.
Yeah.
But because he felt like Yuzu just constantly feels like a criminal, and every little small action that he takes has weighed on his mind, I think that's what sort of led him to the stage of these bigger acts of injustice.
So after all this happens and he's put in the asylum, his brother takes him back to Tohoku, back to northeastern Japan, and gives him some like crappy house in the countryside, right? With an ugly maidservant who plays tricks on him and like gives him laxatives. And then his father dies, which is also a big moment in the book.
So Yozo's constantly been craving his father's attention and his father's affections, but he feels like he never really got it. And now when he finally dies, when the father dies, he feels a huge sense of relief.
Yeah. Which is sort of, you don't get that like super strongly in most of the book. It's only towards the end that you're really getting the impact that the father has had on him.
At the start of the book, there are some indications that the father's relationship is important, but it's sort of downplayed. It's not really.
A lot of that is general in the book, right? Things are understated.
It was important to Yozo what such a person who stands for what the society seems to consider right things, all the right things. Like he's a member of the political party. He's working for the society. He is recognized as an important figure in society. I think it's important to Yozo what such a person thinks about him, and he never really gets these opinions, and that's what plays on his. That's what leads him to do a lot of things as well.
Yeah, that's the end of the Notebook, and at the very end we have Yozo sort of coming to grips with the situation and at least establishing a sort of baseline above depression, right? And we have this quote.
Everything will pass. This is the only thing I have felt to be truthful concerning the world of so-called human beings, where I have lived, crying out in agonizing pain up to the present. Everything will pass. I will be 27 this year. My white hairs have grown considerably in number, so to most people I will look more than 40.
And we have the postscript we're going back to the unnamed narrator, who we guess is Dazai. He gets these notebooks from the madam at the bar where Yozo was living for a time, and then she makes this comment, which is, well, she blames Yozo's father for everything. So again, you have that parental element coming in, which is not really highlighted until the end here. And then she also calls him an angel. Madam calls Yozo an angel, and like he's really clearly she thought of him as very sweet. She's really highlighting this point where Yozo is much kinder and more thoughtful than he perceived himself to be. So there's clearly some element of like mental illness or just a failure to correctly perceive himself and his own positive traits.
This happens a lot in the book, where the external society, the society that Yozo feels doesn't understand him and who he feels disconnected from, is actually always perceiving him to be a fairly normal person who's funny, who's good looking, who can have relationships with women, who can make friends,
right,
who can make money. So I think the society always sees him as the sort of functioning person, but Yozo himself never has this perception.
Right, which makes it feel like sort of the whole book is sort of, I mean, you can definitely view it in the lens of mental illness, because it's just the whole time he's sort of got this distorted view of himself and how he's interacting in the world, and everyone else seems to view him as much more of a normal person.
Someone is suffering from mental illness and they read this book, they might be able to connect to some of the things he is saying, maybe. Dazai is writing about all these things that you wouldn't normally hear in daily conversation.
Yeah, book as a sort of like cognitive behavioral therapy on yourself in a way, right? If you have those beliefs in your own head about everything I do is terrible, catastrophizing things where you think, if I mess up a little bit, it's going to be a really big problem. But then you see Yozo in the book, thinking the same way, but clearly it's a flaw in his own mental perception, and the rest of the world doesn't see him that way, and you can understand that and like apply that to yourself, then I think it makes it easier on you in some way.
So No Longer Human, although it's such a difficult and it focuses on so much hard content and there's so much grief in it, it's also strangely hopeful in a way.
Yes, more hopeful than Dazai's actual life. But I mean, I think Dazai clearly had some mental illness if he tried to commit suicide 5 times.
I think anyone who wrote this book has to have experienced some of these things on their own to be able to write about it in this way.
Well, I mean, this is, super autobiographical, so for sure. In the broad tradition of Japanese literature, this book is very close to being what you would call a shishosetsu, which is like an I novel, which is a tradition in Japan of writing novels that are very autobiographical. Although to call this book an I novel is a bit controversial because Donald Keene, who is the translator for the version we're reading, he says this isn't an I novel because Dazai has deliberately modified events for artistic purposes and to highlight his themes. So it's not 100% autobiographical, but it's clearly in that direction.
So Dazai has used a lot of events that happened in his own life, but then added a lot of interpretation that he might not have had in real life, which is what makes, I think, which is the success of this book, really.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely made it an artistic work, right? I mean, especially like the Antonym game or something. It seems like that's probably an artistic creation.
No Longer Human is a very popular book in Japan, and a lot of people in Japan have read it. On many lists, it's considered to be one of its best-selling books. And so, naturally, it's got some movie adaptations. So I've watched the film adaptation of the book, which came out in 2009, which was the 100th anniversary of Dazai's birth. Not the anniversary of his book, but when Dazai was actually born. And it was substandard.
The movie I watched is also not available in English, and it's called Ningen Shikaku Dazai Osamu to Sanin no Onana Tachi, which is like No Longer Human, Dazai Osamu and 3 women. And it's sort of more of a biopic almost. It's not really a film adaptation of the book. It's the story of how he wrote the book and his like affairs with these women and how they also influenced his writing of the book. And I think it was decent. The actors are very attractive. The filmography is good. Like the director, she is like has a really good sense of color, I think. But the acting is kind of meh.
Well, at any rate, I think both, so the 2009 film adaptation and the 2019 film adaptation, both aren't great. And I think maybe they're more interesting to a viewer who has read the book or who's familiar with Dazai's life or who's familiar with Dazai's other works. But in itself, if you want to judge No Longer Human by watching these films, I don't think that's a good idea. I would not personally recommend it.
Yeah.
I think, Alex, as you were saying, the newer film, certainly good for eye candy. There's lots of good visuals, and there's also anime adaptation. I've heard some good reviews of the anime. It's called Bungo Stray Dogs.
Yeah, for people who are into anime, might be a good way to get into it.
Well, there's also manga, which has also got reasonably decent reviews. It's by Furuya Osamaru. There were attempts at adapting this book into films or other formats, but I think it's a very difficult book to adapt.
I mean, it's a really psychological book.
Its value, really, for me personally as a reader, was in all the monologues and the things that happen outside of the plot. So I had to read the book a few times, really, to really feel its weight. And the first time I read it, because I was just, reading through it in a sort of fast way, and when you do that, you focus on the plot. And that kind of turned me off because not much happens apart from Yozo getting drunk and sleeping with women and doing drugs. But when you look past that and when you get into Yozo's head, I think that's what really makes a difference to the reader.
I personally really like this book, and I think it's one of my favorite books in modern Japanese literature. And I really like the psychology and just sort of the self-analysis. And it also reminded me of a little bit of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his Confessions, and sort of that same sense of self-pity and self-analysis that is really engrossing.
Yeah, and also influence from Dostoevsky, which we were talking about before. It's a very good book. You have to give it its due. It's sort of like you have to focus on the right things to be able to enjoy it. So that was the end of our episodes about No Longer Human by Dazai Osamu. So as we mentioned before in the first series of this podcast, talking about books set in the post-war period in Japan. So the next book we're going to be reading is a favorite of mine. It's The Temple of the Golden Pavilion by Mishima Yukio.
There should be lots to talk about.
Yeah, Mishima was a very interesting character. The book is rich.
The temple itself is the rebuilding of the temple is still around, and it's a major tourist site, so you can go visit it if you get interested in it.
In Kyoto, in Japan. Yeah, so watch this space for the next episode, and thank you so much for listening to this episode.